Welcome, Augustonians. I'm extremely honored and excited to welcome Bernardine Evaristo. She is the 2019 Man Booker Prize winning author, dramatist, essayist, radio writer. She does everything. Her career has been very long and fruitful and productive, and always working on trying to construct stories that show different perspectives of the African diasporic experience, all the way from first century Rome to contemporary times. And it is very, very important that we understand our positionalities in different places in history, that we've always been here, and that we see multifaceted images of ourselves as Black women in an international context, because it's through that way that we gain a deeper understanding of the possibilities of our lives. This event is pre-recorded because as Lit Friday expands, we are including international guests such as Bernardine, and we have to make sure that we're able to respect people's availability based on their time zone. So we welcome you to the watch party. We're excited that you're here with us, and Bernardine is here to help us inaugurate this practice. She is our first international guest, so this is the first time we're doing the watch party, and thank you for being available for that. And now I'm going to read her bio. Bernardine Evaristo is the author of the 2019 Booker Prize winning novel, Girl, Woman, Other. This is the book. This is a lovely cover. It's backwards, but you get the point. Her numerous other works span the genres of fiction, verse fiction, short fiction, poetry, essays, literary criticism, and radio and theater drama. Other fiction titles include Mr. Loverman, Blonde Roots, and Lara. That should be a book, right? Maybe you'll write one called Blonde Robots. Her writing is celebrated for its experimentation, daring, subversion, and challenging the myths of Afro-diasporic identities and histories. A staunch and long-standing activist and advocate for the inclusion of artists and writers of color, Evaristo has initiated several successful schemes to ensure increased representation in the creative industries. She is professor of creative writing at Brunel University, London. And for her extended bio, please visit blueflowerarts.com. That's where you can get the entire illustrious history of this very hardworking, creative artist that we're gonna speak to today. So we are elated, as I said in kind of like our preamble. We're so excited to have you. Thank you so much for being with us. And I just wanted to say, when I was doing my research on your career and I saw the photos of that hot pink pantsuit, I was in love. It's great. It's amazing. And now it's something I aspire to. One day I will have my own photo. But you are going to read for us something from your book or something you've chosen. We're ready to listen.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and hello everybody. Absolutely delighted to be talking to you from London in the UK. I'm going to read from Girl, Woman, Other, and I'm going to read from the opening pages. So it's a novel about 12 primarily Black British women. I say primarily because one character is non-binary. And they're aged 19 to 93, and the book spans their lives, and they are also somehow interconnected. And the first character who opens the book is somebody called Amma. And Amma is on her way to the theatre. Amma is on the way to the National Theatre, which, as you can tell, is like the National Theatre of the UK. And she's opening a play there. That evening. It's the morning, and she's been in theatre for 40 years, and she comes from a very radical feminist background as a theatre maker, and she's always felt like she's on the outside, and now she's opening a play in the middle of the in the heart of the establishment, and she's written it and directed it, and it's called The Last Amazon of Tahomey. So I'm going to read you a bit from the opening. Amma is walking along the promenade of the waterway that bisects her city. A few early morning barges cruise slowly by. To her left is the nautical-themed footbridge with its deck-like walkway and sailing mast pylons. To her right is the bend in the river as it heads east past Waterloo Bridge towards the dome of St. Paul's. She feels the sun begin to rise, the air still breezy before the city clogs up with heat and fumes. A violinist plays something suitably uplifting further along the promenade. Amma's play, The Last Amazon of Tahomey, opens at the National tonight. She thinks back to when she started out in theatre in the 80s, when she and her running mates, Dominique, developed a reputation for heckling shows that offended their political sensibilities. Their powerfully trained actors' voices projected from the back of the stalls before they made a quick getaway. They believed in protest that was public, disruptive, and downright annoying to those at the other end of it. She remembers pouring a pint of beer over the head of a theatre director whose play featured semi-naked black women running around on stage behaving like idiots before doing a runner into the back streets of Hammersmith, howling. Amma then spent decades on the fringe, a renegade lobbing hand grenades at the establishment that excluded her, until the mainstream began to absorb what was once radical, and she found herself hopeful of joining it, which only happened when the first female artistic director assumed the helm of the National 3 years ago. After so long hearing a polite no from her predecessors, she received a phone call just after breakfast one Monday morning when her life stretched emptily ahead with only television dramas to look forward to. Love the script, must do it. Will you also direct it for us? I know it's short notice, but are you free for coffee this week at all? Amma takes a sip of her Americano with its customary Kickstarter extra shot in it as she approaches the brutalist grey arts complex ahead. At least they try to enliven the bunker-like concrete with neon light displays these days, and the venue has a reputation for being progressive rather than traditionalist. Years ago, she expected to be evicted as soon as she dared walk through its doors, a time when people really did wear their smartest clothes to go to the theatre and look down their noses at those not in the proper attire. She wants people to bring their curiosity to her plays, doesn't give a damn what they wear, has her own sod-you style anyway, which has evolved, it's true, away from the cliched denim dungarees, Che Guevara beret, PLO scarf, and ever-present badge of 2 interlocked female symbols. Talk about wearing your heart on your sleeve, girl. These days, she wears silver or gold trainers in winter, fail-safe Birkies in summer. Winter, it's black slacks, either baggy or tight, depending on whether she's a size 12 or 14 that week, a size smaller on top. Summer, it's patterned harem pants that end just below the knee. Winter, it's bright asymmetric shirts, jumpers, jackets, coats. Year-round, her peroxide dreadlocks are trained to stick up like candles on a birthday cake. Silver hoop earrings, chunky African bangles, and pink lipstick are her perennial signature style statement. Yaz, her daughter, recently described her style as a mad old woman look, mum. Pleads with her to shop in Marks and Spencer like normal mothers, refuses to be spotted alongside her when they're supposed to be walking down the street together. Yaz knows full well that Amma will always be anything but normal, and as she's in her 50s, she's not old yet, although try and telling that to a 19-year-old. In any case, aging is nothing to be ashamed of, especially when the entire human race is in it together. Although sometimes it seems that she alone among her friends wants to celebrate getting older, because it's such a privilege not to die prematurely, she tells them, as the night draws in around her kitchen table in her cosy terraced house in Brixton. As they get stuck into the dishes each one has brought: chickpea stew, jerk chicken, Greek salad, lentil curry, roasted vegetables, Moroccan lamb, saffron rice, beetroot and kale salad, jollof quinoa and gluten-free pasta for the really irritating fusspots. As they pour themselves a glass of wine, vodka, fewer calories, or something more liver-friendly if under doctor's orders. She expects them to approve of her bucking the trend of middle-age moaning. Instead, she gets bemused smiles and, what about arthritic flare-ups, memory loss, and hot sweats? There you go, little taster.
So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about right away, is the characterizations are so rich. And even in the beginning, as you talk about Yaz having this ageism around her mother, there's still so much about her mother that reads as contemporary to me. Even the menu she eats with her friends are things that are kind of, you could find in like a millennial dinner, or even like, you know, a Gen Z dinner. And so I wanted to talk about just not all the 12 characters, but as a collective, a lot of conversations about girl, woman, other, have kind of focused almost exclusively on race. When I was doing my research, I noticed that gender kind of slips into the conversation. But these characterizations are so specific and rich and strong. The novel almost reads like a manual of tolerance and love. All of these characters have issues with each other's personalities and issues with each other's politics, but there seems to be tolerance as a way of loving and love as a way through tolerance. Can you talk to me about how you constructed this like extended community and just that aspect of there's love and tolerance there, and how that works for you as a writer as you're making your characters?
Yes. So interesting, because I think the book is actually, it's a compassionate book, and it's written from a compassionate position. So it's my 8th book. So I have had a lot of experience of writing characters, and I began writing for theatre. So even before I started publishing books, I was writing characters for theatre. So in a sense, this book is the culmination of nearly 40 years of writing characters. And I love it when people say to me, oh, your characters are so rich, they come alive, they're so distinctive. And that's what I wanted to create. And it comes out of that very long history, not only as a writer, writing all these characters who are not these ones in this book, but lots of other characters, but also as somebody who has lived as an adult, surrounded by lots of people, because, you know, I even though I'm a writer, I'm also a professor, and I'm an activist, and I do a lot of touring all over the world, and I'm quite a social animal, sort of, I guess. And so I have been around, I have a very wide social circle, and I've been around a lot of women, but also a lot of Black women and women of color for all those decades, since the early 1980s. And so everything, in a sense, that I've kind of picked up about who we are in this society, and also using my imagination, obviously, because I'm a writer of fiction, goes into those characterizations. And it's really important to me as a writer that those characters come across as real, that they feel credible, not authentic. I don't like using the word authentic, because I think, what does that mean exactly, right? So, but that they feel real and credible, and that they leap off the page. And one of the ways you do that as a writer is you make them, imperfect people in an imperfect world. So with each character, you hopefully get quite a complex image of them. They have a strong personality, right? But you see them from different perspectives. You see them from how they present themselves, because each character has their own section in the book, but you also see them from how other people see them. And that might be a friend or a mother, or a colleague, or a grandmother, or even great-grandmother. So you have this multiple perspective on them, and we see their strengths, and if we want to sort of be reductive about it, but we see their strengths and we see their weaknesses, and but we also understand them. And it's really important for me as a writer of long form fiction that actually with all my books, you get a sense of where people have come from, and the journey they've made to the point at which they are, perhaps they appear in the book in this case. So Amma, you meet Amma as somebody who's in her late 50s, but actually you also experience her when she was younger, through her own story, but also through a little bit through the stories of others. And I think all of that creates this sort of, there is a compassion that is absolutely infusing the novel. So I'm not judging those characters. I'm allowing them to breathe, to be who they are. And because they have their flaws as well as, everything else going for them. I think they come across as very real, and that, people get what they get from it.
I mean, I think there's also a way that when you dedicate so much attention to the characterization, I've read a lot of wonderful fiction that when I think of the characters as individuals, I kind of only have maybe like a 2-dimensional grasp of them. But you, of course, you're the author, but you give the characters a certain level of knowing who's close to them, and omniscience, and an ability to predict. There's like this particular relationship between, I think the character's name is Shirley, and her mother, where Shirley's estimation of herself is one way, and her mother is very much like, Shirley's a dumper. Like, she's gonna put everything on you when something's wrong with her. And in a minute, I felt like, as a reader, as an individual, very like called on. Like, and thinking about the relationship with my own mother, and like, what would, what do people who love me and would give anything to me actually think about me? But regardless, there's that compassion, right? There's that giving. And I think it enhanced the humor in the text as well, like having these insights from all these different multifaceted perspectives.
Well, there is the case, there is, I think, as human beings in the world, we do have our own image of ourselves. And then there is what other people think of us. And often there is a disconnect between the two. And often we're not actually aware of that.
No.
Right? So, and that applies to all of us. So that is one of the things that I'm playing with, how people present themselves, usually with a certain amount of moral rectitude, right? Like, I'm a good person and this is why I do X, Y, or Z. And then you get other people sometimes, puncturing their self-image, stabbing at their sort of the balloon of who they think they are, and undermining them and contradicting them, actually.
And everyone's vulnerable, right? I think about that in the character Sylvester, who's the same age as Amma, a longtime friend of hers, who's like very gregarious, outspoken, very political, but he's also has this level of judgment of Amma, like, oh, you're establishment now, like, you're not in the fight anymore. And the rectitude he has around being radical, being a little bit of an anarchist, and being confrontational.
That's Sylvester.
Right,
that's Sylvester.
Sylvester is actually in an absence of him, like, being able to acknowledge his white privilege in some ways as a character. And so I just found that extremely compelling. But could you talk about the humor in your work? It's so surprising and cutting. Like, that's what got me through some of the hardest parts. Some of the tragedies that occur is that there's always this buoyancy in the characters, very specific to each one, around humor. What does humor do for you in your writing, and also just in life in general?
Yeah, it's interesting because humor is one of the things I find it hardest to talk about with the book. I can talk about almost anything to do with the book, and have done, but it's really hard to analyze humor for me. And actually, I consider the humor in this book to be very gentle, because you should read my book Blonde Roots, right, which is a satire on slavery, and that is savage humor, really savage. So I think this is like gentle humor, which is kind of like poking fun at people's foibles, but we still, hopefully we still like them anyway. As a writer, I'm always balancing comedy and tragedy. Sometimes, the extremes of that, and sometimes it's not so dramatic. In this book, there are moments where it is dramatic, and people do undergo serious trauma. Although I have to say that this is not a book about trauma, because it's so interesting. When I started talking about this book, when it was published in May last year, there were some people who assumed it was about suffering. And I said to them, why do you think it's about suffering? Well, it's about all these Black women. It's so funny that they have this assumption and stereotype that somehow we are these victims walking around being beaten up, emotionally and in every other way possible, and we're suffering. And I'm not interested in writing that. I'm absolutely not interested in writing victims, because I don't think that gets us anywhere. I want to write characters who have agency. So the book isn't about suffering, but it is, people do, obviously, 12 characters, over 100 years, obviously there are going to be moments where some of the characters do suffer, and some of them are struggling, and maybe they're all in different ways struggling to a greater or lesser extent. So there's that. But then the humor for me is what makes writing fiction worthwhile. Because if I don't have humor in my writing, I feel it's failed. I need to be able to read my work and to be laughing. And some of the characters in the novel make me laugh still. And people find it strange when I say, oh, I'm very entertained by Yaz, or I'm very entertained by Hattie, the 93-year-old farmer. Yeah. And they're like, what do you mean you're entertained, but you're the writer? Yes, I'm the writer, but at the same time, I'm enjoying my creations. Because I feel, I don't know where it comes from, but when I was writing in my 20s and I was writing poetry, I think my aim was, and I was a very different kind of person then. I was quite angry, and I was sort of coming into my own, and I was understanding how, racism worked, and the patriarchy and all the sort of ideology around that and resistance to it. and I wanted to make people pay, right? So when I wrote, I wanted people to cry. I wanted them to cry with me. And, you know, I mean, I don't know how I survived this long, but, you know, in the 20s, I would have like a bottle of whiskey, or a bottle of Cointreau, or a bottle of Drambuie, really thick, sickly liqueurs, you know, Cointreau and Drambuie. And I'd have the Cointreau on its own, and I'd mix the whiskey with the Drambuie. And I would chain smoke Marlboro light cigarettes, and I would be writing late at night. So I'd get into the zone probably about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and I'd basically get drunk and hopefully write some poetry before I got drunk. And then in the morning, I'd see what I'd done, you know, what I'd written, and it was usually a mess, right? So, so that was where I was coming from. And then by the time I got to my 30s, everything shifted, and I suddenly liked comedy. You know, I don't think I was really into comedy in my 20s. And so, but I don't know what happened, but I lightened up. And as I always say, I turn down, get into energy. And also you go through this sort of coming of age period, which for me was quite long, you know, maybe it's for everyone, you know, about 10 years when you're in your 20s and you're discovering yourself, and then you come out of it stronger. And then I also just wanted to enjoy life, and my attitude changed. And that's when my writing started to have humor in it, because it didn't have humor in it much up to that point. So it's probably in my second book, Lara, where my sort of, you know, my sense of humor started to permeate my fiction. And so I think for me, what the humor does, it shows me that the writing is kind of, it's got its own unique qualities to it. Maybe that's what I think. And so when it doesn't have the humor, it's almost as if I feel anybody could have written it. You know, the prose feels flat, but the humor elevates it into something else, and the humor comes and goes.
It reminds me of that saying, you have to be able to laugh at yourself.
Yeah.
Like, speak about yourself in your 20s. And myself as a writer, I remember going through my 20s in like a very similar way with different liquors, but very much trying to interact intimately, or what I thought intimacy was, as well as like numb. And so going between these like wild alterations, but it's just it's very human. It's a very human thing to do. And I think to some extent a lot of artists end up being permeated with that fantasy of like, well, that's what you do when you're a young writer. I remember having a professor that was like, never edit papers until you've had a glass of rum. And I was like, what? I remember that. Narciso Menocal. I remember him telling me that. But also it just draws me back into the idea of like Blackness as always being like, not only like this kind of like epidermal overlay that cuts off or precludes your humanity, but also has some kind of expectation of suffering, right? And it's as if what Black women in particular in this novel go through does have an element of it being based in race. However, losing family members, losing lovers, experiencing life as it ebbs and flows in a very natural way has an aspect of race because they're Black, but not everything that they experience is kind of atypical of the human experience because of it. And that's what I enjoyed about it. You got to see the characters have their lives and go up and down and have their own personal developments, and also a certain kind of resilience. And it's not this resilience that's very popular with self-care nowadays, where it's like, oh, well, you manifested this because you had to learn a lesson or something like that. It's this resilience that's born of what they needed at the time. Yeah. And then that resilience, I think, also enraptures me because so much of the resilience is found in sex, in the sexual lives, not exclusively.
In the novel?
In the novel. Like, I find that these women...
I love this. No, listen, I love this when people offer me an interpretation of the novel that I haven't thought about.
It's just this opportunity to, it's like, when you're reintroduced, it seems like a lot of the women characters are often reintroduced to themselves through others, because that's the human experience. Right. Sometimes when you go along by yourself and you're in your head down for so long, just working and having your friendships, that when intimacy happens, it shows you that other very vulnerable face of yourself. Mm-hmm. And I find that there's there's like an arc, right? So right now, one of the books I'm reading is this, and it's called
I like
The
that.
Black Female Body, A Photographic History by Deborah Willis and Carla Williams. And what it is that it's this
Let me just write that down.
Of course. I can like send you whatever you need.
Yeah, send it to me. Yeah.
It's this historic map via photography of how Black women's bodies have been overdetermined by the white male gaze, starting as soon as like the 15th century in a Portuguese poem, and coming up to the present. And it does this very, very deep analysis about agency, vulnerability, but also about the economics that were behind how the Black woman's body became overdetermined as either being like the Jezebel or the mammy figure. And it goes between predominantly the United States, France, and England, studying these, in Africa, studying these like photographic archives. And, you know, looking at the sexual Amma having two partners, being polyamorous, right? Morgan being transsexual, but also like agendered, experiencing a very intimate relationship with Bibi. Bumi kind of going through the second half of her life after her children have been raised, experiencing queer love, and then experiencing love that's heteronormative, but at the same time freeing for her personality. Or Shirley's mother having the affair. I don't want to give too much of the book away because it's so good. Or Shirley's mother having the affair with a very young man in her older life, and thinking about these women being empowered and afraid, but still courageous in their experience of their sexual life. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, because I think that there's this huge debate right now, this is probably going on for the last 10 years with the advent of like Cardi B, Nicki Minaj, City Girls, all of these like very like globally famous women who are really grasping on to this idea of twerk music and, you know, like twerking as like a Black transnational aesthetic, and how the conversation is, does this hurt or help? Does this harm? What does it do? And so I think that your characters kind of stand up intergenerationally in this conversation. So how do you see the sexual narratives of your women characters, your Black women characters?
That's so interesting. Can you tell me what talk means?
So twerking, Twerk.
Oh, twerking.
Twerking.
Oh, I call it twerking. Okay,
Yes.
okay.
And so, you know what I'm talking about now.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, sure.
It's like isolation, hip abdomen base isolation dancing.
Oh yeah, I know twerking.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So in terms of the women and their sexuality and their relationship to desire, I definitely didn't want this. For a start, the book could not be a heterosexual novel, because that felt to me like it wouldn't be true to life. And then I also didn't want to have a token gesture to queer relationships. So actually a quarter of the women are in some way queer or have queer experiences. And that was really important to me. And I'm really proud of that, actually.
And real.
Sorry?
And real.
It's real. And one of the reasons I'm so proud of it is because this book now in the UK has gone out to Middle England. And I think it's probably blowing some of their minds, you know, because they're reading it because it won the Booker and it's a bestseller. And so they're now, well, okay, when did they ever read about Black lesbians, right? Never, probably, because we're not in fiction in this country. I mean, I can say that almost categorically, we do not exist in fiction, or Black lesbians do not exist in fiction. I used to be a lesbian, I'm not anymore. So, So I had all these different relationships. And as you said, you know, the thing about when you're in intimate relationships is that as a writer, it is a chance to show people's vulnerability and to show their intimacy. So, and also to explore the power dynamic between relationships, and also just to explore wider issues. And I think that's always something that I do with my novels. When people are in a relationship, whether it's heterosexual or queer or whatever, it's never just about, maybe it never is anyway, but it's never just about two people making love. It's always about so much more than that. And I do pack this book out with lots of layers of meaning. And that is partly because it's written in this experimental fusion fiction, but also have a background as a poet. And that is where you do compress a lot of ideas into not a lot of text. So I'm exploring sort of wider things. And also because I wanted to explore the multiplicity of Black British womanhood, it was really important to me that no two women would have the same kind of trajectory or be in any way the same, even though they might have a similar starting point, such as Amma and Dominique or Amma and Shirley, but they're all very, very distinctly different. And then one of the most interesting things about the way in which I think I explore relationships is that there are women who are having sexual encounters, but they're not relationships. Well, some of them are sexual encounters in or without, or not in a relationship, where the power dynamic is really acute. So, for example, two lesbians in an abusive relationship, which was really, I loved exploring that because I knew nobody had done that, and I knew that often lesbians are kind of, they're almost like protected. They're like a protected species, and they're idealized and mythologized, and I didn't want to do that. And even straight people, of course, many straight people are reading this book and they're really shocked at the power dynamic between that lesbian relationship, which I won't go into anymore. And I think, why are you shocked? Because you're straight, you probably don't know any queer people or don't think you know any queer people, and yet you're shocked that what we understand some heterosexual relationships to be about abusive, that it's happening in a lesbian relationship. And also happening in a lesbian relationship where they don't part, where the person who is, being abused actually stays in that relationship. Mm-hmm. So it's also at a deeper level exploring the psychology of that kind of power dynamic and why people stay in these toxic relationships. I think the book is exploring so many things. Every time I talk about it, I discover new things to say because there are these 12 characters and they're all doing something different. And then you have the different generations, and you have the fact that there's one character who's 93 years old, right? And her mother, actually, who was born in the 19th century, and also having sexual encounters with her husband, where there is no language for it. Mm-hmm. You're talking about the 1920s. There was no language for what happens in that relationship, and no understanding. And this is before psychoanalysis, right? So people were just in these things were happening to them, talking about, women in our bodies. They were just happening to them, and people had to live with them. And there is also a lot of silence in the book around what the women go through. Some of the women, when they do go through things that are outside the norm, and that will include abuse and maybe betrayal. Mm-hmm. There is silence. People don't talk about it. And of course, we know that is also very, very true, especially with some of the earlier generations. So I think there are lots of things at play, but as a writer, for me, having them in relationships, having sexual encounters, exploding the idea, because Megan considers themselves to be pansexual. Mm-hmm. So you have someone who's polyamorous, you have someone who's pansexual, and then you have somebody who is completely monogamous and heterosexual. And then you have the book is in conversation with all these things. And the women are so different, so many of them, that they're not relating to each other, many of them. And actually, girl, woman, other. So the other, we know, means many things, but also they're also othering each other. Right. So these are some of my ideas around what you're talking about,
But that also signals the multiplicity of Blackness, even within what someone would be determined to be like a homogeneous group, right? I think that a big part of racism, especially around Black women, is like the homogenizing of our experience, no matter where we're from. But this novel in particular draws upon, a specific locale, it's England, and then inviting in characters like Nzinga, who's African-American and from the United States, kind of shows how there's a similarity, but there's also a disconnect based on personal experience, right? And the similarity is really having to deal with a homogenous political experience that seems to reproduce over and over again the same kinds of oppressions that have to be personally interfaced with by these individuals who are of the African diaspora. And thinking about sexuality and intimacy, you know, romance precedes psychoanalysis. And sometimes when I read psychoanalysis, you know, Freud, Fanon, you know, on and on and on, I think about how so much of that work is based on this almost like, it's mostly in fiction and poetry, this romanticizing of love and romance, and those expectations are kind of what gets people into trouble. The unacknowledged vulnerability, the unacknowledged need is what leads to relationships that have a disjointed power structure. Because when I read the relationship between the two characters that were experiencing domestic violence, the progress of it wasn't much different from the what would be considered a heteronormative progress. There's the, passing off the critiques at the beginning, passing off the isolation at the beginning, then the isolation becomes more acute, then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera happens. And also how delicate you were, and not really having it be all about like the physicality, which is definitely a part of domestic violence and was in their relationship, but it was also very much mentally disconnecting somebody from themselves and emotionally disconnecting someone from themselves. And I think that that's is part of why I loved reading this so much, because I could see how relationships are seen as a negotiation, and any relationship is a negotiation of the self, right? It's like whenever you encounter somebody, that's what's going to happen. And so because we're talking about like Dominique and Nzinga, that lesbian couple who had the interaction, I wanted to talk about transnational Blackness as well. How, while being disconnected from our own histories via institutional control, we're also disconnected from each other's histories and having the opportunity to understand and come together. And I think often when Black people from different ethnicities or nationalities interact, there seems to be maybe this implication that it's like, but no, this is how it happens for all of us. And it's like, no, that's how it happened for you there during this time. And whereas the political structures mirror how Black people have been treated historically, there is kind of like a difference based on that. And I wanted you to talk more about this idea you tackled in the book between Nzinga, who's African-American, and Dominique, who's Black British, both of very different historical contexts, and then immigrating to the United States to be together. And what was revealed in terms of each other's perspectives of what Blackness is. Not only was it an emotional battle, there was an intellectual battle over Blackness. And I wanted to talk more about that.
So just to go back to one of the earlier things that you said about, the idea that we're all homogenous, and, that's what stereotyping is, right? The assumption that somehow we're all the same. That was definitely the project of the book. But what I found so interesting in some people's responses to the book is that they would say, oh, now I understand Black British women. And it was as if they saw my 12 characters primarily as a definition of Black British womanhood. And I always had to say to people, still have to say to people, obviously not to Black women, because we know better, right? That actually what I've done is I've opened the possibilities. I've explored the possibilities of Black British womanhood, but this book does not represent Black British womanhood. It's about 12 individual characters. There are, I don't know how many of us there are in this country, but no single novel can or should be expected to somehow reduce all the multiplicities of who we are into 12 characters. And they would never say that of, for example, a book about 12 white characters. Right. So I find that extremely interesting. And so, sorry, what was the very last thing you asked?
The transnational Blackness.
Transnational, yes, transnational. Yes. So it's really interesting because there isn't much of a conversation between Black Britain and America. I mean, obviously there is on lots of individual levels, I'm sure. But I think there is one-way traffic, essentially, because we do know about you, right? We do know, we think we know anyway. When you go to America, you realize that America is so diverse in so many ways. You're in Miami and you're in one culture, and then you're in, I don't know, East Hampton, you're in another country. It's just, you know, it's unbelievably diverse. So unlike the UK in that sense, because we're a tiny little island, really. But we do know a lot about American culture, and we feel that we know about African American culture. So we know about slavery in America. We know about the civil rights movement. We obviously know about Black Lives Matter and everything that's happening at the moment, and we've gone through our own kind of micro version of that here, and sort of disproportionate number of Black people in prisons. We have that here too. So there are sort of comparisons to be made between America and the UK. We definitely know about African American films, stars, music. It's all in, you know, America is the global imperialist, cultural imperialist, if you like, today, right? And there's a reason for that, because obviously so much is going on, so much amazing creativity, culture, so on and so forth, that transcends the borders of the country. So we do know about that, and we know about African American literature. I grew up, you know, once I started to become politicized and look for Black books which weren't available in the UK in the 80s, you know, this sort of canon of African American women writers, that's what I turned to, you know, and it was Audre Lorde and Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, and, you know, so on and so forth. Sorry?
Zora Neale Hurston.
Zora Neale Hurston, who I came to a bit later, but yeah, Zora Neale Hurston. And so they were absolutely inspirational for me as a struggling young woman trying to be a writer, because although they weren't telling the story of Black Britain or of Africa, they were telling stories where Black people, and in particular the women, Black women, were at the center of the narrative. So that was really, really important. But then again, at a certain stage, I had to kind of like withdraw a bit from African American women's novels, because I was overwhelmed by the brilliance of their writing. And, you know, this culture is so different here in the UK. And I was so seduced by, you know, the descriptive powers of people like Toni Morrison, but the landscape is so different, the history, the culture, the language, everything. And I needed to learn to value what we have here. And I started to do that with maybe with my first book, which was in '94, but certainly my second book, Lara, which is about my family history. And it's a fictionalized version of my family history, which is white and Nigerian, Brazilian, Irish, German, and mixed race, growing up in London in the 60s and 70s. And when I started writing that, I thought, oh, nobody's going to be interested. I mean, I'm not talking about Georgia or Ohio or whatever. This is a British story, and nobody's going to be interested in it. But I had to work through that in order to write that story. And of course, people were interested in it. So the impact of African American culture is amazing here. And a lot of people in this country, they have family in America, especially people from the Caribbean, but also people from Africa. So, you know, we have a very different history. You mentioned my book, The Emperor's Babe, which goes back to the Roman occupation nearly 2,000 years ago, right? But in terms of a sort of a continuous recorded presence of Black people in the UK, we have it, but people cannot trace their lineage through it in any way. So, you know, there were African Americans who fought in the Civil War, who came and lived, they were given their freedom and they lived in London. And there were thousands of them, you know, but then they just go into the
century, Queen Elizabeth saying, I want all of the black
get rid of the blacks
on the street and put in jail and shipped to the colonies.
That's right.
There's a contingency of Black British people from the 16th century who ended up enslaved in the United States because of the advent of racism and the advent of capitalism.
Yeah, so we had these communities, and we've always had migration, but not on a massive scale, and it doesn't feel permanent. And so basically, the people who have come into the UK and married over the centuries have gone into the bloodstream. So I'm sure when people get their DNA tested, right, they're going to discover, you know, a lot of people.
Penelope in the book.
Don't, you're giving the game away.
I'm gonna stop. I can't stop talking about it because it's so.
Blank that out, folks. Blank that out.
Blank it out.
But yeah, so they're going to discover that presence. So then from the middle of the 20th century, that's when we had the real major migration of people from the Caribbean and from African countries. And that was because of the, you know, they were all part of the British Empire. And, you know, the British Empire stretched over, you know, owned a quarter of the world, right? And so they were British citizens and they came to this country, and there was first generation, second generation, and subsequent generations. So it's a very, very different history. And so I'm the second generation. So the people who came from the first generation, I would say most of them were struggling. They were, you know, they were there to do the jobs that British people didn't want to do. And you know, we're just trying to find their feet and raise their children so their children could have a better life. And then you've got the second generation who are being raised and educated into the culture, and subsequent generations. And so, you know, we're now very, you know, most people will now claim themselves to be Black British, but my generation, a lot of people, even though they were born and raised in Britain, did not accept that they were Black British. And so, but we haven't had up to this point, for example, a really big middle class in this country, Black middle class, and it's growing, but we still don't have it. We're still a minority, much more of a minority than African Americans are, for example. And then we have all kinds of issues around equal rights, access to every area of society, discrimination, you name it. You know, one of the things that really inspires me about America is that you have a really solid middle class, you have a powerful Black political class, Black middle class, and you also have a very powerful academic class. You know, people who are in the academy working at every level. So we have about 20,000 professors in the UK. They are, so in the UK, a professor is the top level of academia. So if you go into academia, there are all these other levels. You know, you go in as a visiting tutor, a lecturer, senior lecturer, and you climb the, you know, if you can, you climb the ladder, and eventually you become professor. So there are 20,000 of them, and there are about 25 Black women, right? Wow. 25, I'm one of them. So it's so different. And there aren't that many of us writing either. So I love the fact that my book has now gone over to America and people are encountering it. And probably for a lot of people, it is opening their eyes about, you know, Black British society and history. But for the books that have existed, most of them have not crossed the Atlantic. But so many of your books continue to come over here. So Brit Bennett's The Vanishing Half, we're all reading that. Great book. So that relationship is I feel it's a one-sided, has always been a one-sided relationship. We're like the sort of second cousins.
I mean, I will also say, just to comment on the question of like imperialism, right? And marketing and marketing dynamics are definitely a part of that. In America, the United States has this invested interest in kind of dispersing African American history as part of popular culture. And whereas now I think there's more of a determination on the part of African Americans as to what goes out there or what's published, I think there's also still a lot of pressure from the white gaze in the United States to produce a certain kind of narrative that may be always kind of drawing up on certain themes and tropes in order for it to be publishable and for it to be a part of the global narrative that, you know, the United States as an imperialist nation uses to educate the rest of the world about race, kind of subtextually in what they're attempting to do. And so whereas there are a lot of Black people in the United States writing, living, scholaring, and producing wonderful theories and texts and stories, there's always this kind of next kind of level of people who are doing things that are more experimental outside of the dominant narrative that do struggle to get published, that do kind of struggle to be seen and represented, because in so many ways, you know, who's popular internationally as a writer, there's a way in which their work kind of does attend to what's expected of a white imagination or a white gaze on some levels, but still doing the work of trying to undermine that. But often as artists, we're doing both. And so that leads to another question I have, because I know you're also an activist and an advocate for diversifying, you know, the artistic field of, you know, England and beyond. And so when I think of the literature industry and the art industry, I think of tokenization a lot. And how there are a lot of opportunities for a lot of Black artists that are precluded because there are already 3 or there are already 4, and there's already this very popular class of people, and so we're not really allowed that much expansion. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on how capitalist gain dictates what we're exposed to, especially when it comes to race and just the literary market.
Sorry, say that question again.
Like what are your ideas on how what we're exposed to has a lot to do with like capitalist gain, and how that often only has this very kind of limited list of Black authors, and how it's bottlenecked kind of.
But you know, I think that's the case with culture, full stop, isn't it? It is driven by the economy and financial factors. And so it's all, the bottom line, it's, for example, in publishing here, and I'm sure in publishing in America, is how much money are we going to make from it? So I think it's completely driven by it, actually. And there are always people fighting against that, but it's dominated. I mean, it is dominated by capitalism, right? This is the system we live with. I think in the UK, you know, for example, the books, let's talk about my field, which, you know, our field, which is literature. You know, the books that sell the most are the really big commercial titles, right? And that will be crime books and thriller and a certain kind of history book, for example, and literary fiction. And fiction by Black authors, poetry and stuff isn't really seen to have much of a market value. And so one of the reasons in which I think I'm coming to understand, at least, that we've been excluded from the publishing industry, and we don't have a good record there at all. I mean, I'm fine, but we don't have a good record, is because people haven't been writing the commercial genres, right? We haven't had, I mean, I'm talking about the 90s now. I don't know who's big at the moment, but, you know, someone like Terry McMillan, for example, who was certainly a massive star in the 90s and a bestseller. We haven't had people writing that commercial fiction. We've always been kind of like, sort of, put into, well, I'm losing my language now, talking all day. We're always expected to write, say, literary fiction. And so if we're not writing those big genre books, then we're not going to be making the publishers much money, and they're not going to be interested in our work. So it's really, really interesting for me, because I've been on the bestseller list in the top 10 for something like 35 weeks off and on. And so I'm really paying attention to the books that are on those lists. And other than around the time of Black Lives Matter, when everybody was curating Black and Asian reading lists and wanted to kind of educate themselves on what was going on, those lists are completely dominated by the Stephen Kings and the James Pattersons, and who else is there? Big, huge American writers, mostly, who are making the publishers a lot of money. So it's a business. Publishing is a business. They need to generate income. It's not a charity. It's not a philanthropic branch of society, and that's the reality. And so we need to be in there writing those books that are going to sell, you know. And my book is selling now, right? But it needed that huge boost of the booker to get out there and to reach a wider readership. But it's an interesting question. But, you know, it's all about capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah. And also, I know we're running down on time, unfortunately, but I also wanted to just talk about the structure, the grammatical and the punctuation structure of the novel itself, because the period is very precious, rarely seen. The comma acts as breath. The line breaks, you know, coming from poetry, allow a reader to understand when someone else is going to speak, or when there's been a change in thought, or there's a change in scenery happening. The star that lets you know that time has passed, or a major setting is changing. And so I think of a lot of other writers who've used these forms. I think of Gertrude Stein, of course. I think of Clarice Lispector, with the not often used period, but the very strong presence of the M dash everywhere. the use of different kind of italics. I think of also how Zora Neale Hurston in her book Sanctified Church is kind of like the playbook that a lot of African American authors especially reference when it comes to trying to standardize kind of like, what is avant-garde? How do we create like a diagram structure for Ave, or also known as Ebonics and stuff like that? And so I see all of these influences, but it just flows. It almost helps how multivocal or multi-voiced the book is. And it helps, it helped me as a reader kind of feel like I was getting on a train and I was dedicated to getting to the end, no matter how many different ways it had to go. Because at the end, I understood that there is supposed to be this understanding that life happens in so many ways and in so many different, and for so many different people, that it's just not a luxury, but like a privilege. Like Alma said, it's a privilege to be able to get older. And it was a privilege to be able to experience so many lives in the book. So it's like, could you talk about your influences in grammatical and like punctuation structure? What inspired you to do this like interdisciplinary format for this book in particular? I know that using form in prose, poetry, and other kinds of poetic forms is common throughout your war of work. But in particular for girl, woman, other, I was just like very, I was made very happy by the structure.
Yeah, you know, I call it fusion fiction. That was the name I came up because it felt like the most appropriate way to describe how the novel is, the novel flows on the page. So the ideas, the language, the narrative, it all flows in a way that wouldn't be able to do if I was using full stops, because as you know, the book's divided into sections. Each woman has her own chapter, and at the end of each subset of each chapter, there's a full stop. But before then, there isn't. And the only punctuation is commas. So there is I think it's a very free-flowing reading experience. And that form, that fusion form, where the full stops don't stop you, you know, don't stop my ideas, don't stop the reader, meant that I was able to compress so much about the women's lives into each chapter. So as you read it, you know, by the time you get to the end of the chapter about Amma or Yaz or Dominique, you know, you probably have a really strong sense of them, because I've kind of used the compression of poetry, although I don't really call the book poetry, but I've used that kind of compression and intensity to explore so much through the shape of the text on the page, so that it is like a stream of consciousness. And then it's also called a fusion fiction because all their stories are fused together. And so it feels to me like you're riding this sort of wave of their subconscious, and you just sort of float through the book. You know, you're in Amma's head, but you're also seeing her from the outside, because don't forget it's written in the third person, but it's close third, so it feels very intimate. You really hear her voice while she's not actually speaking most of the time. So you're floating along, and then you're into Yaz's consciousness, and you're seeing things from Yaz's perspective, and then you're in Dominique, and then whoa, then you got Carol, completely different, kind of not connected, but then you discover that there are connections. And so for me it's fusion fiction. And also as a writer, in terms of my practice, it was very free to write, very hard to edit, understood why you need a full stop, understood why you need paragraphs, and that's because it's 120,000 words. So I'm not writing short poems in that form, I'm writing like huge chunks of text. So really, really hard to edit it for many reasons, not least the time, juggling all the time frames, but also just seeing what I've done, because, you know, when the writing is so free flowing, there's a lot of trimming that needs to happen. And that was really hard to do. It took me a long time to edit, and I needed help for people to look at it and to help me kind of like see where I needed to work on it. And it's also a form that I used in my previous book, Mr. Loverman, but the book is a parallel narrative. There are two. Well, there's one main protagonist, a gay 74-year-old Caribbean man, and then his wife, Carmel, is the secondary protagonist. And I kind of used that form, but a little bit more poetic for her sections, and I absolutely loved it, because I felt that it was just so liberating for me as a writer. I can track the origin of that form back to Ntozake Shange's The Colour Girls Who Consider Suicide in the Rainbow's Enough. Now, she didn't use that form. Don't think so anyway, but I saw it on stage when it came to London about 1980. Unfortunately, at that time, theatre was empty. Today, it would be packed. But I was just blown away by it. Stage performance, 7 women, different stories, kind of like flowing into each other. And then, of course, the book stands up as a poetry collection anyway. And I think that shaped my theatre practice, which when I left drama school, I formed Theatre of Black Women, which was Britain's first Black women's theatre company. And actually, Paulette Randall was, I formed it with Paulette Randall. We were at drama school together, and somebody called Patricia St. Hilaire. And the reason I say Paulette Randall is because I know for a long time she was on, and this is the August Wilson Centre, no, August Wilson, yeah.
Right.
She directed a lot of his plays in London. So some people might recognise Paulette's name. So we left drama school, we formed this theatre company, we wanted to create theatre. We'd spent 3 years training to be actors, but also learning how to create your own shows, because that was the kind of course I was on. And then we decided, you know, really influenced by Ntozake Shange, and then decided that we were going to just do our own thing, and started writing. I started writing theatre through poetry, and felt that I did not want to box my creativity into these sort of existing theatrical conventions that I did not feel I was a part of in Britain. And most definitely wasn't a part of it 40 years ago. And that has continued. That's why I've been such an experimental writer in a sense. I've always been interested in exploring the forms that suit whatever it is I have to say. And I've had some dead ends, and I've tried to be conventional, and I've spent years trying to be conventional, and then written a very conventional novel, and then it didn't work, and that was Lara, and then I turned it into a novel in verse, and suddenly it worked. I haven't got time to go through that, but yeah, always trying to find the form that works for whatever it is I want to say. And you know what I think about Go Woman Other? I think the form helps the story to lift off the page. And so when people read it, it's almost like they're just in the story. They're flowing in the story, they're connecting to it. And it's almost as if, and this may sound a bit weird, but it's almost as if the language disappears because of how it's been written in that kind of very unconventional way, where you're just kind of like, as I said, kind of floating along with it.
There are moments in it that are very imagistic. And I did have that in my notes, where there were times where I did feel like I was watching a movie, or I felt like, especially in the last chapter, I just felt like I was just sitting there. Like, yes. I felt like I was sitting on a bench in that setting, in that scene, and just kind of watching everything happen. And it was very immersive for me to not have to kind of attend to, because sometimes I think when you have complex sentences or compound sentences, there's a way where even when they're done well, you might have to go back and look again. And, to make sure you're kind of reading things in their priority correctly. But I didn't have to do that. My mind was able to kind of take in all of the sensual experience of the read, of everything I could taste, see, smell, and hear, and the voices of the characters as my mind delivered it to me, that kind of took me.
Yes. Can I just say something that I was going to say earlier? And that is that because I began writing for theatre, and I began professionally writing my own plays, one woman or two women plays. And so I was writing my work, but then also performing it as an actor, which is very different to performance poetry, right? Because what I was doing was completely inhabiting the parts that I'd created. And I think that has shaped my writing ever since, in terms of the way in which I inhabit my characters, and the way in which my characters are communicated off the page. And that goes back to those early years, those few years when I was very young, writing and performing and really inhabiting and getting under the skin of my characters. And when I am writing, books, which is what I do now, mainly, I really have to get under the skin of the characters for that to be a rich writing experience for me.
I mean, I think that if I ever decided to write fiction, which I have, that would be something I would want to do. Like maybe I would want to take an acting class in order for me to understand exactly how to embody and then translate that into writing. And so we are running out of time, and the conversation has been lovely. But we've talked a lot about Amma. And in another interview that I did in my research, someone had asked and kind of pushed a little, like, how much is Amma based on your life experience? And so it seems that art does imitate life, because you did answer their question and you were like, well, it's like it was 40 years for Amma to get the play at the National, and it's been 40 years for me getting the Man Booker. But the question is, there are a lot of artists, brilliant singers, writers who are Black, who get to a point where they just stop, or they start to do it for themselves. And it's been a lifetime you've dedicated to your work, sometimes with the intimate rewards of those who are familiar with you, and maybe sometimes without any rewards at all. It's just the reward of your work. How have you, as an individual, encouraged yourself to keep going? What are some of the things that you've learned about how to keep going if you were going to live a life as a writer, as an artist? And also, like, what is the power of Black art in the world? Because at the end of your novel, everybody is drawn together by this very avant-garde instance of new, fresh work from a queer, lesbian, Black woman's perspective. So how did you manage to stick to writing as a life, and how does that relate to the power of Black art in the world?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that I've been with my publisher for 20 years. So I've been very lucky in that sense. And my publisher in the UK is called Hamish Hamilton, and they are the most literary imprint of Penguin Random House. So it's not as if I was cast adrift and I wasn't able to get published over these years, because I have been published since '94, and I got my first contract, I think, in 1992, so nearly 30 years. So, and I had a publisher who stood by me even when I wasn't making him much money. And so I didn't, when I won the Booker, it was, a huge shift in terms of every aspect of my career. But I'd already had a really sort of healthy career up to that point. I had won awards, and, I was very well reviewed, and I've been touring for over 20 years as a writer all over the world. So there are many aspects of my career that were successful. I wasn't earning a lot of money, but then I wasn't earning a lot of money when I was working for theatre. So I have had a very financially precarious existence until 2011, when I got a job at Brunel University in London. It was actually called Brunel University London. And suddenly I had a salary, but up until that point, I didn't have a salary. But that was an investment that I made in my creativity, because I realized that I didn't want to do anything else. I wanted to lead the creative life. And so until I got the job, and actually I didn't realize that if you actually work in the academy, your creativity is part of your job description. They want you to continue to produce work, and then, and certainly in my institution, they don't overwork you and so on. So it worked both ways, it still does. But so it's a choice that I made. And a lot of people I came up with in the 1980s who were writing with me, and, they were writing for theatre, or, we had a collective, and we published a couple of Black women's books, in the poetry books in the 80s. I would say probably about 90% of them stopped. Either they didn't really want to do it, they were just dabbling maybe, and they might be very talented, but they weren't that keen. And those who were more committed eventually gave up and chose to take other directions in life. And of course, you can juggle the two. You can continue with your creativity and also have the day job. And, but they didn't choose to do that. So I knew that I was determined never to give up doing what I love doing. But it was also, it felt to me like it wasn't even a choice. It was like, because what else was I going to do? My soul would have been crushed if I'd have stopped being creative. So it's that has kept me going. Plus, I did a lot of work on myself in the 1990s. Not therapy, I've never done therapy, but I did a lot of personal development courses where, Americans are very good at this, and a lot of these things come out of America, where I learned to become unstoppable, and I learned to set really, really big goals for my life. And I learned to train my mind to be very positive in terms of how I see everything in the world. Obviously, you can't achieve that all the time, but it's always there in me. to always see the positive, and also not even to see failure as failure, but to see it as it's a learning, you know, it's a learning, it's part of your learning curve. And if you want something, you don't get it, you bounce back. And I have been bouncing back for a very long time because I have been incredibly ambitious, but I didn't break through in a big way, and other people did. And you know, you have to live with that as well, that you want to be on the main stage, but you're not really supposed to tell anyone because you're a woman and you're a black woman and you're British. So you hold your cards very close to your chest, but you want to reach a wide audience. Isn't that what we want as artists? You know, we're communicators, and we want to be out there and want our work to be out there. And that didn't happen. And there was, you know, I just didn't reach a tipping point. So I'd get great reviews, but my books wouldn't sell well. And I might win awards, but not the really big awards. And that's how it continued for you know, all those decades. And then when it did happen for me last October, I was so ready for it, because in a sense, I've been in training for 40 years, and also I'm really exploiting it completely 100%, but also I really appreciate it, because I know what it's like not to have it. And I'm so grateful that I'm in this position where I am in huge demand. My books are selling all over the world, you know, foreign languages all over the place. And that is such a privileged position to be in as a writer, even during the pandemic and everything else that's gone on. So I would say to people, you have to want to do it. You have to love doing it. You need to be passionate about it. And you need to make decisions that will keep you on track. I'm lucky, I never wanted children. I come from a very large family, I did not want children. So I've never had to have children. If I did have children, I may have had to take some other kind of work that was going to, you know, support myself and my child and my husband or whatever. So you know, it's about total 100% commitment to the craft. It's about believing in yourself. It's about finding the support networks that will help you to continue. It's about developing your craft. I'm not the writer I am today. I could not have written Girl, Woman, Other 10 years ago, 20 years ago, definitely not in my 20s. So I've written it because I have developed my craft and continue to develop my craft. I don't see myself as a finished product. You know, I'm still wanting to learn how to be a better, more interesting writer. That's always going to be the case for me. And then you have to be resourceful, you have to be tenacious, you have to not just bounce back from the setbacks, but you also need to, you know, make the connections with people that you need to make to keep going. If it helps to have a portfolio career, have that portfolio career, so that you're not committed to any one institution, but you're just juggling lots of other things, but you're still able to write. It's about creating a support network in your life through your paid work, if you're not being paid for your writing, your paid work, your relationships, your family, you know, your networks, so that your living situation. I lived very cheaply for a very long time and didn't have my own home until 5 years ago, right? So a lot of people would not, except in this country, they would have, you know, a lot of people went off and got mortgages. They got jobs and they got mortgages. I never did that. And it's all come well now, right? But for a very long time, I was like, wow, I don't have a car. I don't have a home. You know, my career isn't breaking through in the way that I want to. And what gets you through that is all those things and incredible self-belief and strength.
Thank you. I think that's all. And also, like, thinking about acknowledgements. When I read the acknowledgements of writers' books, when you talk about community and support, sometimes the people that keep you creative and creating aren't other artists.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the most intimate person. So many acknowledgements start with, I want to thank my grandmother for reading. I want to thank my sister for reading this. Because it is people who can give you like an outside perspective. And I think that that's all wonderful advice, right? It's the advice of taking responsibility for the self, but it's also the advice of just being realistic about the world you're moving in as well.
Yes, and just one more thing. If you can, stay away from the naysayers, right? Because they will destroy you. You know, so I'm going to be working on a new novel next year, and so many people are saying, what is it? What is it? And I'm not going to tell them. They will find out when that book is published, because, you know, especially, well, you know, with your creativity, you have to be really careful about protecting it and be really, really careful about who you share it with and at what stage you start to talk about it. A lot of people
I'm going to quote you, don't feed your dreams to the lions.
That's it. Don't feed your dreams. That's it. Don't feed your dreams to the lions. And they may be the closest people to you, right? I remember my mother saying to me years ago, and I haven't thrown this back in her face, but I remember saying to me, well, you know, people are never going to buy your books.
Oh.
She's being kind. She's preparing me for failure, right? Oh. And I haven't said to her recently, Mom, have you seen how many books I'm selling? But, you know, so you have to be really, you have to protect it. You have to protect your creativity. And sometimes you just keep it to yourself until it's ready to go out there. Or you maybe share it with 1 or 2 people who you trust and who are going to give you really constructive feedback. But don't just go talking about it to all these people. And they'll come back and say things to you like, oh, no, that's not going to work. And, you know, you just don't do that.
Or ask you why. That's the worst part.
Yeah.
Why do you do that? It's like, because I want to.
Yeah, so don't tell them, you know, protect, don't feed your dreams to the lions, folks.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
So generous and generative for me. And I'm sure you've been very generous and generative for everyone else. It has been an honor to have you. Everybody, I don't know if you're all seeing this backwards, but.
No, we can see it.
Right.
I can see it, yes.
You don't have to start here. You can start with Lara. You can start with the Emperor's Babe. You can start with Mr. Loverman. You can start wherever you want to, but dig in and get ready, because they're all very beautiful, multifaceted texts, and it's always an adventure. And thank you so
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. That was a really lovely interview. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.